All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, Understanding Dew Point. Before we get started, I have just a few housekeeping notes to mention and community guidelines to go over. So if you have any sound or technical issues today, please let me know in the chat box with a direct message, and I'll do my best to help you out. This webinar is being recorded, and the recording, as well as a PDF of the slideshow, is going to be sent out to all registrants probably within the next week or so. And we're going to be doing a brief Q&A at the end of the presentation, but please feel free to send your questions in the chat box throughout the presentation, and then we'll get to them all at the end. And finally, we ask that you hold each other with mutual respect, come to this space teachable, and stay engaged with our presenter throughout the program. So I just want to share a little bit about the Documentary Heritage Preservation Services for New York program. DHPSNY, as we like to call ourselves, is a collaboration between the New York State Archives and the New York State Library, with services provided by the Conservation Center for Art and Historic Artifacts. DHPSNY is a statewide program that provides free planning and education services to support the vast network of collecting institutions, such as archives, libraries, historical societies, museums, and other organizations that safeguard and ensure access to New York's historical records and library research materials. DHPSNY services include archival needs assessments, educational programs, preservation and condition surveys, strategic planning assistance, and a whole plethora of other resources. So to learn more about our services, please visit DHPSNY.org. And with that, I'm going to pass things over to Kelly to get us started today.
Great, thank you. Let's see if it advances. I'm hoping, yep. Okay. Well, thank you all for joining me this afternoon. Dew point is a topic that I'm actually really excited to be talking about today. Over the years of working with environmental data and with cultural heritage institutions on how to implement sustainable preservation practices, it's really made me a bit of a convert, and realizing the potential that dew point holds as kind of this third parameter of the standard environmental factors that we talk about, along with temperature and relative humidity. And so I hope today I can convince you of its potential and to add it into your data analysis routines. So just a little bit of background on me. I trained as an art conservator at the Winterthur University of Delaware program in art conservation. I spent 6.5 years at the Image Permanence Institute in upstate New York, working with museums, libraries, and archives to implement sustainable preservation practices. And since then have worked as senior preventive conservator for the National Museum Cardiff, and since September have come to Colonial Williamsburg as the preventive conservator here. At CW, we have a team of about 25 people responsible for the implementation of preventive care practices. We care for 2 fine arts museums, soon to have a new archaeological building that we're pretty excited about, as well as about 40 plus historic buildings. So work a lot with environmental data, and excited to share anything I've learned that can be useful to you all. Sorry for all the colors, but I know when we're talking about data and dew point and everything, I wanted to make sure not to get too bogged down in graphs and everything, give you some structure to kind of center this all around. I think some of the discussion about temperature and relative humidity, what is dew point, how do we control it both passively and mechanically, might be review for some of you, maybe not. And then I think the things that I'm really excited about to get to today is to show you some examples of how dew point can inform the actions you can take to mitigate environmental risks, as well as to give you some profiles to help with data interpretation. We kind of put together about 5 different examples of different types of dew point graphs, so you can maybe see where yours falls in comparison to those, and so what it might be telling you. And then finally, we'll end with some tips and other considerations for going forward with dew point analysis. So I don't think we'll go the full 2 hours by any means, but I'm excited for the questions, and yeah, we'll see how it goes. So just to, again, starting where probably most of us are familiar, temperature is a measure of the speed of the molecules moving. So the faster the temperature, the faster the molecules are moving. That means chemical reactions are going to occur faster, which means chemical decay, or what we would refer to as natural aging, is going to occur at a faster rate. So as a result, we generally want to keep collections at lower temperatures, or at least avoid sustained highs. Certainly, once we get beyond the point of human comfort, then we're accelerating chemical decay beyond the need for preservation or for access. And again, this is sort of largely irreversible. If you picture like yellowed and brittle newspaper that's been kept in an attic, this is kind of a good example of both visual and structural damage that can be caused by high temperatures. And in addition, temperature can accelerate other processes. So not only does it make things more appealing for pests and biological growth, but it can also make the effects from light and pollutants worse as well. So relative humidity, which is probably the parameter that most of us are used to thinking about in terms of moisture management, is a measure of the water vapor content of air. Generally, we're going to be looking to maintain that between 30 and 60%. This is a good balance to avoid the risks of a lot of the mechanical damage from materials releasing and absorbing moisture, and so changing in size and building up stress and strain. As well as avoiding the issues at higher relative humidities that come with biological growth, accelerated metals corrosion, even things like dye bleeds or softening of adhesives. That said, sometimes those numbers move a little bit depending on the history of the collection, or what specific materials are present in there. But that's generally what we're looking at. And I put the question up there as well, because I think like we're so used to talking about relative humidity, but if you're not used to thinking about dew point, then I think the question becomes, what relative to what? What is this humidity relative to? So for dew point, this is the more formal definition of it, but it's the temperature at which water vapor in the air becomes saturated and water droplets begin to form, or so where it's going to start to condense out. This may or may not make too much sense visually, but I think the classic example of a visualization of dew point is really, if you think of, we're going into summer, you take a nice cool drink outside and you get those water droplets forming on the outside of the glass. So in that instance, we've done, we'll talk about this later in the webinar, but we've crossed the dew point, condensation has occurred, and we're having that water come out. So kind of keep that in mind too when we talk about cooling coils and things. So as I said, I spent a number of years at the Image Permanence Institute. This is one of their resources. I think it's also a really helpful visual when we start talking about how these three parameters interact. So in this example, the size of the buckets relates to the temperature. And so as the temperature increases, the bucket gets bigger. It can hold more and more. So but the amount of moisture that's present in the air, think of that as your dew point. So in this example, the amount of moisture is constant across all of these buckets. Dew point's the same. We haven't done anything to change it. But as that container grows in size, the relative amount of space that the water is occupying compared to that empty space is decreasing. And so that's what's meant by relative humidity. So hopefully that makes sense in terms of if you're familiar with conservation heating, or sometimes the emergency recommendations, if people can't dehumidify and their relative humidity starts to increase, sometimes people recommend increasing the temperature to try to bring that back down. So that's where this is coming from. They're not actually removing any moisture, but they're making that container big enough that the relative humidity is going down. So I think the useful thing to keep in mind here, and we'll see it in another format in just on the next slide, but as that temperature increases, the relative humidity is going down and vice versa. And the other thing is to say that in this example, the dew point isn't changing. There's only so many ways that we can actually affect the dew points, and you'll see that throughout the webinar. So this is the DP resource. This is an online dew point calculator. There are multiple ones of these. I happen to like this one because it is tied to preservation metrics, but these are just three screenshots of different settings meant to illustrate the exact same thing of what we talked about with the buckets. So in all of these instances, we have a 50-degree dew point. I chose 50 because that's fairly standard for a mechanical system, unless you've specified and been lucky enough to get something else from a preservation perspective. You're likely looking at somewhere around a 50-degree dew point. And you can see when we're at 60, it's a lower temperature, we're up to a 68% relative humidity, which probably caused some concerns for many of you with certain types of collections. And then as we increase that temperature on up to 80, you can see how the relative humidity is starting to come down. So you can use this resource to kind of play around and see with specific numbers how your dew point locked in, how you can change the temperature in RH and which combinations are possible. So not every combination is possible at specific dew points. So it's just another way to visualize this. Okay, so moving on to the types of control, I'm hoping that kind of makes sense in terms of how dew point relates to temperature in RH. But if there's further questions, we can certainly address that again as well. From a preventive conservation standpoint, we talk a lot about levels of control, and each of these are kind of protective envelopes around an object. It's an opportunity to address a risk, mitigate it further, and prevent it from reaching the object. And so that's how I would really recommend that we approach both data analysis more generally, but also from the perspective of dew point, is we kind of want to start with the outside and work our way in to see how we're controlling it at each of these points and how effective we are at managing our moisture levels. So you'll see this format a lot throughout here. I just did really straightforward graphs with no numbers on them. The general idea is just the visual trend to see what something could look like without having to worry about the specifics of it. But this is intended to be representative of what you might see if you pulled up a dew point graph of your outside air. So what's immediately outside your building. There's three ways that you could get this graph. One, you could have a monitor that's outside and is collecting this data. You download it the same as you would your other monitors, and it would calculate a dew point, and you pull it up in whatever graphing software you chose to use. Two, some of the software does have the ability to connect with different outside air sources. So depending on where the nearest weather station is, or if your region or country has provides that data, they can usually import it. So you might have access through that. And then the third version is something that the Getty's been working on, but there are calculations that you can do through Excel if you're not using graphing software that's specific for types of monitors. You can also have it calculate the dew point through Excel. So there's three different ways you could get here, but this is essentially what you'd be looking at, especially for the New York region. And you can kind of see, if you imagine that the two ends, I don't know if you can see my mouse or not, but to the far left and right, you can see that the moisture levels are low. That would be in winter. And then we have high moisture levels in the summer. And here in the spring and fall, they're in between those two, and you see your biggest fluctuations as they're reaching those levels. So this is generally what you would see in those types of climates. For places that see fewer seasonal swings, certainly would see less of an extreme in terms of your outside dew point, but just a good place to start. If you don't have mechanical control and you have your outside data and you bring up data from within your building in a space, you will see something that looks similar to your outside air, but essentially a buffered version. So it's not going to reach the same highs and lows as fast. It's maybe won't even reach the same extremes if they're not maintained. And yeah, you just generally see this more buffered version, but it's still following the same trends, especially over longer periods of time. And if this is what you're seeing, your general goal is going to be that you want to reduce sources of added moisture. You don't have the mechanical means, so that building envelope is that outermost level of the levels of control that you can use to impact your dew point. So you want to stop as much moisture as possible from coming in the summer. And that might look like making sure the gutters are directing water far enough away from the walls. There's no interior leaks or sources of moisture running that could potentially add to this. And I'll have some examples towards the end where you can see what the graph would look like if you do have internal sources of moisture. But in general, instead of this buffered version, you'll see it either try to maintain a different point and maybe won't drop again, or it won't go up as high. Or yeah, it'll just show some different behavior than what is happening with outside. The other option, if you don't have mechanical control, is to move further on in those levels of control and pull up the dew point graph for wherever you might be monitoring elsewhere. So if you have a dehumidifier or a humidifier running within a space, you can pull that up with the outside air and see what the difference is. A lot of times people will try to look at the effectiveness of these mitigation measures through relative humidity, but if you recall back to that intro section, because relative humidity is kind of more of a, I think I'll use this term again, but more of a consequence of the moisture level you have and the size of the container you have. Sometimes looking at relative humidity, the results can be a little bit harder to tell. So I would really encourage you to instead look at dew point and see how the moisture level is being affected there. In this example, whether it's a dehumidifier, and you can see that it's stopping the purple line with the room with the dehumidifier running is stopping the total moisture content from getting quite as high as the outside air. We can see that it's somewhat effective, maybe not enough, but you know, you can make that call. As well as oftentimes people will monitor within storage enclosures, and this can be an effective way to see how much buffering you're getting from different types of boxes. I've seen institutions make decisions about the cost effectiveness of different enclosures by seeing how well they do at buffering against moisture changes compared to the cost. Because the more you invest in kind of those passive means, the less you'd have to do mechanically. So even if you do have mechanical means of controlling your environment, I would still really encourage you to start by pulling up these data sets and looking at dew point and seeing what can be done to reduce the load on the mechanical system. Okay. Now we'll move more into if you have mechanical control. There's going to be some key information that you want to get to be able to understand what the dew point is that you're capable of achieving and whether the system has been able to do that successfully. And there's a couple of ways that you can get this information. One would be through the documentation related to the HVAC system. Often there's as-builts that would list what the cooling coil is capable of achieving. There can be gauges on the sides of the mechanical system that show what temperature the chilled water is being supplied at. You can talk to your facilities department, who should be able to provide you with information about the dew point of the mechanical system, as well as for the chilled water, or you can monitor. So those are really kind of the 4 ways to get at what your mechanical system is capable of providing. I'm going to take just a step back to kind of talk about these photos a little bit, but in general, with the mechanical control that I'm talking about today, it involves a component cooling coil, which is within an air handler. And this cooling coil has chilled water supplied to it that runs through it, and the air is going to pass over it. As a result of the air passing over a cold surface, it's going to drop in temperature as well. And so that cooling coil is going to be what condenses that water out. We're making that bucket small and we're getting the moisture out. So your chilled water is either going to come from some kind of tower within your own facility, or if you're on a municipal or campus supply, you might have it piped in from somewhere else. But to the right there, you can see an image of some of the chilled water going in. Usually it's fairly easy to tell where the cooling coil is in a mechanical system because you'll see all these pipes, as well as some pipes coming out. You may even see in the summer some water coming out, what looks like water coming out of it. That's the condensate, what's condensed out of the air coming out of the system and being directed towards a drain. Okay, so if you look at the image up here, this is a screenshot of what the software that controls an HVAC system can look like. This is another way to tell what, if you talk to facilities, this is probably what they will look at to be able to tell what your cooling coil is achieving. Often they're either labeled CC or in this case, it's abbreviation for chilled water, and blue, but that component with the arrow pointing towards it, that's our cooling coil. And you can see on the right what it looks like in real life. So there's your coil with the water running, cooling that pipe. The air is going to pass over it. And there is, again, I hope you can see my arrow, but the moisture is going to condense out and go through that piping back to the drain. So the cooling coil here, this is the component that gets our bucket small enough that we're removing moisture. And so in many systems, this is the primary way that we can dehumidify and remove moisture. Otherwise, increasing temperatures or things like that, it's not actually changing the total moisture that we have within a space. Okay, sorry. I know this is a lot. I'm hoping it's not, I'm not going too fast, but with this graph, what I wanted to convey was we talked about that 50-degree dew point kind of being sort of a default for a lot of mechanical systems. And I wanted to kind of put it in your mind of like, if your cooling coil and chilled water, if you're capable of a 50-degree dew point, that equates to a 70-degree, 50% RH environment. So, obviously that's not the only possibility when we think about how we could play with those sliders and, maybe we accept a higher relative humidity at a lower temperature. But when you hear 50 degrees, kind of use that as a benchmark. And I know that if I hear a number that's higher than 50 degrees, that automatically means before I even look at temperature and RH, I know either the temperature has to be higher, so I'm looking at an increased risk of chemical decay potentially. The RH has to be higher, in which case I might be getting concerned about some of the risks for mold germination or other things, or both of those things are true. The reverse of that scenario is if you find out that your system's capable of a 45-degree dew point, for example, that means that either you'd have absolutely no problem achieving 70 degrees and 50% relative humidity. You could have a lower temperature than 70 degrees and still maintain 50%. You could have a lower relative humidity at room conditions and be able to maintain it, or potentially some combination of lower temperatures and lower relative humidity. So that's kind of a good breaking point. I think we're all fairly familiar with that 70-50 environment. So just to say, depending on where your dew point falls, it's either, if it's a higher number than 50, it means conditions that are going to be potentially worse for preservation than that standard environment. Or if it's a lower number than 50, it means you have some opportunities for improved preservation. Okay. With this, I just kind of wanted to throw, it's kind of building off of that as well, but just to drive home the point of, if you think about like a 60-degree dew point, how much moisture that means is in that container. You can only lower the temperature and shrink that container so much before you're going to hit that, you're going to hit a relative humidity that's going to be too high for collections, and be looking to condense out. Whereas at the 40-degree dew point, we can shrink that container quite a bit more before we're at risk for too high relative humidity. So hopefully that makes sense, but it's just to say we have more options for temperature and RH control at lower dew points, but with our mechanical systems, it's often kind of a locked-in option. Okay, I'm going to make it just a really side note tangent that probably won't apply to most people, but I was worried that if I left it out, there would be somebody who this would impact. So desiccant wheels are another option aside from cooling coils. We've run into them a handful of times. They're not super common, but they can be useful. Typically, desiccant wheels are used in places where you either have a really high moisture load. So if you're somewhere where the outside air is just always really humid, excuse me, or you're trying to achieve a really low relative humidity. So here at Colonial Williamsburg, we use them in instances where we have cold storage. So we have low temperatures, but we also we need a lower relative humidity, or for spaces with archaeological metals, for example, where they need a lower RH. Excuse me. Okay. So the way these basically work, it's pretty much, excuse me, exactly how it sounds. The wheel spins, it has a desiccant in it, and this desiccant works exactly like silica gel, or activated carbon, which you may be familiar with. The air is going to pass over it. It absorbs the moisture from the passing air and then provides that into the system. The wheel rotates and is exhausted to the outside. So it's removing the moisture in that way. Because this doesn't involve water, it's totally different than dew point. If you have a desiccant wheel in your system, what I'm saying about dew point will not be relevant. I'm just kind of banking on the fact that most people don't have them, but if you do have this, the dew point is totally separate. They operate differently. And the reason, because they don't have that water component, they don't have to worry about, you can only get so close to freezing before you have to add chemicals to the water to keep it moving through pipes. So that's one of the limitations with a cooling coil. For a desiccant, since we don't have that, we can essentially design and program what relative humidity we want and kind of lock it in that way. So they can be useful in specific environments, but because of the expense and maintenance, we don't often see them unless it's really critical for achieving that lower H in cultural heritage. Okay. The reverse of the dehumidification component is humidification. And I just wanted to show you some images of what humidifiers would look like within the system. So on the far left, you can see this kind of piping going across. And then in the middle image, you can see kind of the holes in the top where the water is kind of injected into the air. So on the right, you can see an image of it kind of in action with that steam being added directly into the airstream. And so by literally adding water to the air, that's how we're increasing the amount of moisture within that bucket. That's how we're humidifying. There are other types of humidifiers. Some of you might have canister humidifications within spaces and things like that, but when it's within a system, this is generally what it looks like, and it's going to be one of those last components before it gets sent to the room. Okay, so from the perspective of mechanical control, and this largely relates to summer conditions, so the timing for this is perfect because I think it'll all be on our minds for the next 6 months or so. But essentially, dew point, again, that's your starting point. Whatever your system is, whatever that cooling coil is designed to achieve, whatever that chilled water temperature is, that locks you into what possibilities you have. The next decision is usually about temperature, and it's usually kind of driven by, I said occupants. It's not always the collection. Often there will be either staff, or if we're talking about a public space, visitors, certain range of temperatures that's acceptable. And then relative humidity is that final consequence. It's that what results from those temperature decisions. We'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to how it can determine set points. So going back to this idea of DEP calc and just kind of giving this visual. So again, if I knew that I had a 55-degree dew point, higher than 50, I know I'm looking at trying to balance some options here between temperature and relative humidity. So if I drop my temperature all the way down to 60, I'm going to say that's way too high of a relative humidity. I can't have 83% in my space. So you might gradually increase that temperature until your RH is brought down within to an acceptable limit. Let's say I wanted to stay below 55 in this example, then I could say, okay, the lowest temperature I can achieve and still have a relative humidity below 55 is 73 degrees. So that might be my summer set point. I hope that's useful. So kind of talked about how dew point can be used to see where there might be, when there's times of the year that there's loads coming from outside, and how we can evaluate the effectiveness of different mitigation measures. This would be another way, would be how to determine set points. So again, I would lock in that dew point, and then I would lower the temperature until the RH hit the point where I no longer felt comfortable with it going higher. And that would be how I could establish my upper limit for summer. One of the other things that I kind of like to give as an analogy when I'm thinking about this is just to say that if, you know, when you travel and you have a certain budget for a trip, that's kind of your dew point, is the amount of money you're willing to spend. And so for the temperature and RH, those parallels are kind of maybe your food and your lodging. And so, you know, I can choose to stay further out from a big city and spend more of my money eating at nice restaurants, or I could have a really nice location central to downtown and, you know, get food from the local grocer or something like that. But either way, I only have so much money to spend. So those choices are going to be different depending on different people's preferences, and it's the same for collections. For, you know, metals, I might be sacrificing that higher temperature to get the RH lower, but for organics, I might need to balance those two risks a little bit more. Okay, so when it comes to determining set points, wanted to go back to the graph a little bit. So this again on the both of these are meant to show your outside air dew point. And if you then draw an invisible line or a real line on your graph for the dew point that you're locked into, any point above there is when you're going to need to dehumidify. You're going to have to remove moisture to get it back down to that line. And at any point that's below that line, you're going to have to be humidifying to bring it up to that line. So this can be really helpful to visualize, because you can see in the graph on the left, nearly throughout the whole year, I have to do some work mechanically in order to meet my set point. I'm always asking the system to do something. Whereas on the right, you can see there's actually times of the year where the system's able to coast and I don't have to do as much work. Maybe that's about a third of the year or so. That could be pretty significant energy savings. And it may not come at any preservation risk at all. So depending on the collection type. So this is where, when we think about that, like plus or minus 2% or plus or minus 5%, plus or minus 10%, that's what's expanding that gap there, and creating what we'd call a dead band, where the system can, as I said, not have to work quite as hard. So keep that in mind as well when we're talking about how dew point can be used to inform your set point. It can also help you understand when you're doing that work and how much you're asking your system to do. It can also be useful in terms of determining the timing of the set points. So, for example, down here, we're getting ready to change over to our summer set points. We have different conditions for different times of the year. So if we don't change over to our summer conditions and we stay at our cooler temperatures, that small bucket is going to fill with all of our added summer moisture very quickly, and we're going to have issues with high relative humidity. So, so we need to transition to a bigger bucket to hold that higher level of moisture. And the easiest way to tell when to change from your winter set points to your summer set points, again, is to look at that outside air dew point graph. You'll often see a time of year when it's consistently crossing the line that you've set with your set point. And once it's gone beyond that point, you're going to want to switch to the appropriate operation. So once it's consistently above that line, I want to move into dehumidification operations so that I can get it back down. And once it's dropped below that line, I want to switch to having humidification so I can raise it up. Okay. Thought it might be useful to see some examples too of how we've used it to inform action. These are graphs of two different spaces just this past winter, just a few months ago. And you can see both of them had these drops in relative humidity. And so the question was, what caused it? What do we do to bring it back up? It's getting a little bit lower than we usually would see. And so we wanted to address it. So at the top, that's that first graph you saw of the relative humidity with the drop. And so we looked at dew point, and you can see that green line there is the outside air dew point, and you can see that it also dropped at that time. So what that tells me is that the moisture level changed, and we weren't able to counter that as we had been previously. And so it showed us that there was an issue with the humidification system, and we needed to look at that component, the humidifiers, and have those repaired. On the opposite end, this was the other relative humidity graph, again, having that drop in RH. Didn't really necessarily see anything going on in dew point, but we did notice that something had happened with the temperature set point, and we'd ended up heating to about 75 degrees in February. So because we were heating so much dry air, we were driving that relative humidity back down. So in this instance, we didn't need to fix anything. We didn't need to address an issue with a component. We just needed to bring that temperature set point back down so that our relative humidity was kept high enough. Sometimes it's an issue with both added moisture and a temperature change, but I think maybe it's easier to see when they're kind of broken out in these two examples, and how that can really make a difference in terms of what your next steps are. But certainly, for an instance like this, we could pump more moisture in to try to bring that RH up, but the much easier solution is just to not heat quite as much in February and bring it back down. Okay, so this is one of my favorite parts of the presentation, but just to show you some examples of profiles, hopefully some of these will look familiar to what you all are seeing in your data and can help with some interpretation. This is the one we started with. It's nice and curved. You can see the seasons, usually higher moisture levels in summer, lower moisture levels in winter, and those extreme fluctuations. When I see a profile like this, I know it's pretty much matching the outside environment. Means probably not a lot of mechanical work being done, not a lot of energy being spent. May or may not meet some preservation needs, but there's probably going to be some challenges with high moisture in the summer and low in winter. So it's generally representing the natural curve. On the exact opposite end, some of you might see in your spaces a very flat dew point graph. So this would be within your building, and it's just pretty much flat across. Exact opposite of what we saw with the curved one, both visually and in terms of implication. So this means that you've set very tight preservation standards, which may or may not be necessary for the collection, but it's tight, it's being maintained. And because it's so different from what's likely occurring outside, it's probably quite a large energy cost. So those are kind of the two extremes in terms of how a dew point graph can look from inside of a building. Within that, there's three variations. So this one I want to show, if you imagine that those two ends where it's more flat, if that's kind of your winter time, and then that middle bit is summer again, you can see it has what we would call a dew point floor. And so the floor essentially acts just like a normal floor. And even though we know from the outside air curves that we looked at that moisture levels are dropping in the winter, our system's working, and it's not letting the moisture go below a certain point. So it's maintaining a floor that it can't drop below. So this would imply that there's humidification present. It's keeping that floor up, it's humidifying, and it's maintaining that line. What you're not seeing is a flat line in the summer, and it's kind of going along with whatever would be happening outside. So we know we don't have any dehumidification. It's just going along with maybe there's some buffering from the building, but it's largely reflective of outside conditions. If you kind of flip those seasons, if we pretend that the ends of this are the summer and the middle is winter, we're seeing the opposite. So what this is implying is a ceiling. And so the system is working to keep the moisture levels below a certain point. You can't break through that ceiling, it's staying where it is. So we have dehumidification. We're not allowing it beyond a certain point. What we don't have is humidification. So we're allowing the space to the moisture levels to drop and to coast along with what's happening outside or what our building's able to buffer. The other thing I wanted to note with your summer ceilings and what you're maintaining is these can change over time. And so this gets into the importance of a long-term data monitoring program. If you notice that, you know, one year you were able to maintain 48 and the next year it was a ceiling of 50 and the next year it's a ceiling of 52, this can sometimes indicate either that the system needs some maintenance or a component is failing, or even that there was just a change in the operation. So it's worth kind of tracking over time and just seeing how consistently you're able to maintain that ceiling just from even from the perspective of monitoring the mechanical system's capabilities. Okay, and the fifth profile and the final one is you can see that we have flat portions in both the winter and the summer. So in this instance, we have a mechanical system that's capable of dehumidification and capable of humidification. But what we are seeing is the fluctuations in what I'll call the shoulder seasons, so spring and fall. And so if you think back to that graph that we had, where there was that band between when we dehumidify and when we humidify, that's what it looks like when we're looking at data from a space. So essentially what's happening in this time is it's humid enough that we're not calling for more humidity, but it's not so humid that we're calling to dehumidify. It's kind of coasting in that band. But a lot of times people will see this in their data and think that there's something wrong with the mechanical system that needs to be addressed. Replacing the mechanical system in this instance won't change what the graph looks like. This would either be an instance where it might be something that would, if it is an issue with the relative humidity for collection, it'd be something that you'd either want to look at the programming for, or even something larger. I've seen it a lot of times if it's like libraries on college campuses. The chilled water comes on at certain times of the year. So if you hit a humid point before that is activated campus wide and you can't dehumidify, your relative humidity will go up. And so changing out that system won't do anything because you don't have the chilled water coming from the supply to do anything with it. I hope that kind of makes sense, because we've seen a couple of instances where you know, people have been concerned about high relative humidities or low relative humidities at certain times of the year when the changeover didn't happen in corresponding to outside conditions, or the fluctuations look too extreme, and HVAC replacements are really expensive and everything. So we want to make sure that if we do that, that it would address the concern. And in these instances, it wouldn't necessarily do that. So this isn't exactly a profile, but I just wanted to show you, if you pull up data from multiple spaces across your institution and you're looking at dew point across a variety of spaces, one of the other things you can do is look for a dew point signature. So if you think of it as if we were all to draw a picture of a cat, we'd probably all come up with some version of a cat, but it maybe wouldn't look all the same. So for each air handler, they're going to, even though they're all reaching probably relatively similar set points, they're going to go about it in slightly different ways, and it gives what's called a dew point signature. And so we can use this to find out which air handlers are serving which spaces if you don't already know. So that makes it a lot easier if we're talking about making changes. We can know which spaces will be impacted. Or if you see the same issue across multiple spaces, it could be tied to a single air handler that needs to be addressed. So in this example, the blue and the orange line, those are very similar signatures. You can see, even though they're not always exactly the same, generally the same pattern, pretty close to the same lines. Green, on the other hand, is showing a different type of signature. It's, you know, generally it's still the same path, but it's not consistent enough, and we probably consider that that has a different air handler serving it. This is kind of a more extreme example, but again, if you have these multiple data from multiple spaces and you're seeing, you might see a moisture load. So you can see here, in this instance, green was following right along with the blue and the orange. If I saw the data from, you know, mid-year back, I'd probably say, oh yeah, these are served by the same spaces. But towards the end of the year, blue and orange drop down and green is still maintaining a level. So obviously it didn't switch which air handler was serving it likely, but it could indicate that there's a moisture load present within that space that's preventing it from dropping down. So we've found different leaks or water sources within rooms because of this, or if it's nearby, depending on what's on the other side of a wall, sometimes greenhouses or other spaces that are conditioned to high humidities. If it's coming through that wall, you might see this in a space, and you can identify that moisture load that's present because it's not dropping down like the other spaces. Okay, that's the bulk of what I'm going to talk about. Now, just a few side things that I just wanted to mention. Again, that term crossing the dew point. This often comes up most likely when we have objects moving from a space with one set point to a different set point. So especially if we're retrieving things from cold storage and bringing them out, there's usually a concern about condensation occurring on an object. It can also be an issue when there's no insulation or vapor barriers in the wall and we cross the dew point within the wall. So that means condensation is occurring within the wall and can lead to mold germination. So what this essentially means here is if the temperature of the object is lower than the dew point of the space it's entering, you have a risk of condensation. So think back to that glass again. You don't want your object to be that glass with the water on it. So as long as the temperature is higher than the dew point of the space it's going into, you're okay. And so you just want to kind of compare those two different areas and make sure that if there is a risk of condensation, that we would bag and let it equilibrate before exposing it to the new conditions. And I'll just add too that you can generally assume temperature equilibration is pretty fast, a couple of hours or so. So generally the objects are going to be the same temperature as the space that it's in unless you've just brought them in. Okay, in terms of tips for analysis, I would hopefully this has been helpful, but just to kind of go over it again, I would try starting with dew point and think about what is the dew point showing you before you even look at temperature and RH. What are you anticipating? What are your concerns going to be at which times of years? Definitely look at those different combinations of data sets. Again, usually it's easiest to start with outside air and then start working through those levels of control, follow that path of the air through the air handler to the different spaces and see, you know, are the spaces that you're expecting to be similar, are they actually similar? Is there an unexpected load that you need to kind of track down the source of? And two of the things that we always stress are to build relationships with facilities departments, because this is a lot of back and forth in terms of risk to the collection and how do we manage it, and having that voice to talk about what's possible and how to best do it is really useful, and having that documentation on hand. So especially given the timing of this, I just want to encourage you to keep an eye on what your dew point is doing for the next 6 months. Right now, this time of year, maybe into May or so, are you seeing that graph where you have the fluctuations in your shoulder season that's suggesting something about the operation of the system when you're switching set points or when you have chilled water supplied? In the summer, is your RH higher than you want? Is that a result of where your ceiling is and what you're capable of doing, or is it a result of temperature choices and work from there? And then in the winter, the same thing. Is the RH going lower than you want? How is that relative humidity that you're seeing related to changes in the moisture level as well as the temperature? And just generally, it can be really helpful in terms of thinking from both a preservation standpoint as well as a sustainability one. Dew point can be useful to see, if you have that dew point locked in, maybe there's a different combination of temperature and RH that would be appropriate for your collection and that the system could achieve, or if there are loads in the space to address. From an energy standpoint, you can see how much outside air you're using compared to that moisture level. Maybe it's too much and it's causing the system to struggle, and that's why you're not able to maintain dehumidification in the summer. Are things operating the way that you think they would be, and effective and performing to the degree that you'd like? Often we've seen portable dehumidifiers installed, and because of the leakiness of structures or the fact that it's an open floor plan or things like that, they may not be performing anywhere near what you think they would be doing. So, because it would relate to more to their usage in addition to just having them sized appropriately. So I'd really encourage you to monitor that and make sure that it is operating in the way that you intended it to do so. Okay. So just in summary, it's just to say that, dew point is really kind of this basis for controlling moisture, whether it's passive or mechanical. But I certainly encourage you to consider the passive means first, and then just to really view mechanical more as, in keeping with the ASHRAE guidelines and everything, that it's to the extent that we need to mitigate risk. We don't need to necessarily achieve a flatline condition. Might not be best for preservation and sustainability. But it can be used for a wide range of things, not only to understand, where issues could be, but to determine your set points, when to change seasons, and how to respond to issues, like I showed in the example of the 2 changes in RH. And then I really hope that the 5 profiles can be useful for you in understanding what you're seeing in your data, and might match things that you're seeing. But the different features and combinations of the data set can really help us understand what components are present, if it's laid out in a way that makes sense, and if it's running in a way that helps you with both your preservation and your energy efficiency goals. I think with that concludes my presentation. I hope it wasn't too much, but I'm happy to answer any questions now. I've also included my email address through Sustainable Heritage at the bottom. I love data and happy to talk about this anytime. So please do reach out, especially if you have specific questions that might be harder to address without the visual component of the data. But no, I'll wait if anyone has any questions.
Yeah, we're just going to give folks a second to type in the chat. We don't have anything in there as of now.
Sure thing. Well, hopefully, yeah, I'm hoping that the silence it's processing, and I haven't totally made it confusing and lost anyone.
I do not think that's the case. I think this was a very robust presentation. Thank you so much for putting all this together, Kelly.
It was fun. Like I said, I've the timing couldn't be better with it going into summer, and I just always felt like this was something that we, as a field, it's hard to get a handle on without having to look at it over and over again. So I'm hopeful that maybe this can serve as something of a resource.
Absolutely. Just going to give folks another minute or so in case everyone is typing. No questions so far, but we did get a couple of thank yous, and I will also echo those thank yous.
Very happy to do it. Yeah, and like I said, I'm available by email or happy to follow up with anything that occurs to people later on, or maybe when you're sitting down with data, and it doesn't quite make sense. Feel free to reach out. I'll go ahead and stop sharing screen then, if that's good.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm not seeing any more questions. So again, folks, if you have any further things you want to chat about, feel free to reach out to Kelly directly, or if you want to go through DHPSNY, you can email me or email our info account. I think I'm gonna go ahead and call it. Enjoy the extra couple of minutes in everyone's day. Thanks again, Kelly, for being here, and I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your Thursday.
Thank you all.
Bye.